All right, y'all bear with me just a second. I'm trying to get my pen going. And it's working. Okay, my name's Meg Graham, and today I'm going to talk to you about the spinal cord and spinal reflexes. So let's get started. I pulled this out of a model here. This is an actual vertebral column that contains a spinal cord. So notice that you have a bony casing around it, but the spinal cord is actually this soft tissue that's encased with this bony casing. A lot of people say, oh, this is a spinal cord. No, that's the spinal column or vertebral column. This yellow thing in the middle is the cord, and these little things coming out from the sides, those are your spinal nerves. First of all, where is the cord? Well, it runs from the level of the foramen magnum, that big hole in the back base of your skull, and it goes all the way down to about the level of the first lumbar vertebra. So if I draw a picture of that, you've got your cord there's your foramen magnum, and it's going to run from the base of the brain all the way down to the level of about L1 or L2. And right there at that level, it kind of makes a point. And we call this point the conus medullaris. And then beneath that point, you just get these little nerves kind of hanging down, and it kind of looks like a horse tail. And so somebody named it cauda, which is tail, equina, which is for horse. So that cauda equina is that just bundle of nerves running down below the level of the spinal cord. This is why you don't have to worry about when you have a spinal tap or a lumbar puncture, whatever you want to call it. They go, oh gosh, this is going to be so bad. I'm going to, they're going to miss, and I'm going to die because they're going to stab my spinal cord. No, they're not, because they usually go in somewhere between L2 and L3, and so all they're doing is they're inserting a needle in there, and those nerves are just going to kind of push away because this is all floating in cerebrospinal fluid. If you were doing something up here higher, yes, then you could puncture the spinal cord, but down here it doesn't matter, so you don't have to worry about a spinal tap paralyzing you or anything like that. Well, what does the spinal cord do? Well, it provides two-way communication between the brain and then all your body tissues. So it receives information, which we would call afferent information because it's bringing information to the spinal cord, and that is sensory information. So it's what the body is sensing about its environment, okay? And then it sends out information, which we call efferent communication, and that's usually motor information. So it brings in sensory information, it sends out motor information. And when I say motor information, I mean it's telling like a muscle to contract or something like that. So it's providing some sort of communication to the tissues. Your spinal cord is protected by this bony casing, but it's also protected by the meninges, and we'll show you these in just a second, but you should have already learned about them. And then, of course, it's also protected by that cerebrospinal fluid, which provides just like a water cushion around the brain and spinal cord. I threw something in here about the epidural space. That's simply because I was talking about anesthesia up here, like a spinal tap or something like that. But the epidural space is this space on top of the dura, which I'm going to talk about in just a second. In fact, let me go ahead and show it to you. You've got 3 layers of mater that cover your spinal cord. Those are called your spinal meninges. You start with the pia mater, which is a very delicate tissue that surrounds the very outside of the spinal cord. So that goes right around here. It adheres closely to the spinal cord, kind of like shrink wrap, and it's full of tiny blood vessels and stuff, and it provides a lot of support. Then you have the next layer, which is the arachnoid mater, and that's this kind of spider web looking stuff here. And that's filled with cerebrospinal fluid, so that's where you get that water cushion around the spinal cord. And then your final layer is your dura mater, which is this gray area right here, and that's a tough, thick coating, and that provides that final layer of protection around that spinal cord. But if you've had a baby, or if you know somebody who's had a baby and they talk about an epidural, what they're talking about is they're inserting the anesthesia right here in this space that's filled with fat above the dura. And that's called your epidural space. So it's that fatty space above the dura. So when you have that kind of anesthesia, you're not actually touching the spinal cord, so you don't have to worry about being paralyzed in that situation either. I don't know why I got hung up on all those types of needles going in your cord, but Maybe I'm feeling like punching somebody right now, or poking somebody with a needle right now. All right, well, anyway, what else do we need to know? Well, you've got this, you've got the different motors that surround the spinal cord, and then you've got this bony casing around it, which we're not going to get into all the parts of that. You should have already learned that when you talked about the bones and skeletal system. Also notice there's one more space here you might hear about is the subarachnoid space. Remember, sub is under, so that's under that arachnoid motor. So that's where that space would be. Now, the next slide I'm going to show you is we're going to just blow up this central part hit right here, just the spinal cord and the nerves that are roots that are coming out of it. So that's what we're going to look at next. So let's start on that one. Basically, what you need to know about this is, first of all, what's dorsal and what's ventral, or what's posterior and anterior. And the easiest way to remember that is look for this big swollen root right here called the dorsal root ganglion. That dorsal root tells you that this is going to be the dorsal side, and then this would be the ventral side. So this dorsal side would be the one that's the most exterior part of your back, and then the ventral side would be more towards your belly. Okay? What you have coming in here, this is your spinal cord going around like right here, but you have information that comes through this spinal nerve right here, and it starts with information coming into the spinal cord. That's going to be your dorsal root, and that's carrying sensory information. So the dorsal root carries sensory information, and it's bringing it to the spinal cord. So we call that afferent, because it's coming to the spinal cord. The ventral root is this one coming out of the spinal cord, and that's carrying information away from the spinal cord, which we would say efferent information. And that carries motor information. So that's going to go out and tell a muscle or a gland or something to contract or squeeze or do whatever. So that's telling some part of your body to do something. Notice both of these come together, though, and that's what forms the spinal root, or excuse me, the spinal nerve. So your spinal nerve is going to carry both sensory information and motor information. It's your dorsal root that carries the sensory information, and it's your ventral root that carries the motor information. All right, so when we come into the spinal cord with this information, you see it coming in right here. You see this like butterfly shaped in here? That is called your gray matter. And the gray matter represents cell bodies of neurons. So this is primarily just tons and tons of cell bodies of neurons. Okay? Again, you've got your dorsal horn of gray matter, or you could call it the posterior horn, which would be right here. You have a lateral horn of gray matter right there. And then you have a ventral horn of gray matter right here. Or you could also call that the anterior horn of gray matter. But all of that gray matter just represents cell bodies of neurons. Then it's surrounded by all this white area, and all of this white area in here represents myelinated neuron fibers. So it's mostly myelinated axons. We'll get into a little bit more about that. It's divided up into different funiculi that you might read about. You don't have to identify the different funiculi, but it makes them, it's like tracks that we'll talk about in just a second. Let me make sure I've covered everything here. All right, also, you need to know this little hole in the center. That's the central canal of the spinal cord, and that has cerebrospinal fluid flowing through it. So you've got your brain cerebrospinal fluid tied in with your spinal cord cerebrospinal fluid. It flows around on the outside of the brain and the outside of the spinal cord, and then it also flows on the inside of the brain through the ventricles, and then the ventricles are tied in with this central canal. So you've got fluid on the inside and on the outside of both the brain and the spinal cord. You also see in here your different dura mater, pia mater, and arachnoid mater. So right here, first the pia mater, remember that's the one that adheres real close to the spinal cord, and you see all the blood vessels and nerves associated with it. Not nerves, excuse me, just blood vessels. Then you have the arachnoid mater, which is this next layer, and that's the one that has kind of the little spider web, and so you would have cerebrospinal fluid floating inside of that. And then finally you have, they call it spinal mater here, but it's usually called dura mater, and that's that tough thick outer coating that you see right there. So those are your basic parts of the spinal cord. Now, let's kind of go over some of these and help you figure out what they do. All right, we said the white matter consists of myelinated axons, and that forms what we call a nerve tract. Well, if you have a bunch of myelinated neurons outside of the central nervous system, you call those a nerve. That's just a peripheral nerve. But inside the central nervous system, when you have a bunch of myelinated neurons, you call that a tract. So a tract is just a bundle of myelinated neurons inside the central nervous system, and that's what forms that white matter. Okay? You have both ascending tracts and descending tracts, and you're not going to have to identify the different ones, but you just need to know that they're there. Your ascending tracts are going to carry sensory information to the spinal cord. So they're coming up to the spinal cord and going to the brain. And then your descending tracts are going to carry motor information. So they're sending signals out like that. So ascending tracts carry sensory information, descending tracts carry motor information. All right, then we said you had that gray butterfly-shaped thing in the middle. That is called the gray matter, and basically it's a collection of neuron cell bodies. The shape of the actual butterfly is unique to each level of the cord. So if you were looking at the lumbar cord versus the thoracic spinal cord, that shape would be very different. And if you take a neuroanatomy class, you'd have to learn all that and know where exactly you were in the cord simply based on the shape of that gray matter, but we're not going to get into that. Notice, though, that the dorsal horn of gray matter, so if you're looking at your spinal cord and you've got your gray matter right here, there's your central canal. Didn't exactly center that very well. But your dorsal horn of gray matter, this part right in here, that would be your dorsal horn. That's going to contain mostly cell bodies of what is called an interneuron. So it's going to be receiving information from the outside, from a sensory neuron, and that's going to synapse with a cell body in here. So let me draw it on this side. So you've got a sensory neuron coming in here, and it synapses with what's known as an interneuron. Interneurons just connect two neurons together. And then that interneuron is going to connect with a motor neuron, which is going to send information out of the spinal cord. So the dorsal horn has cell bodies of interneurons mostly. The ventral horn here is going to contain cell bodies of motor neurons. And that will come into play later on. All right. Well, remember we talked about your spinal nerves. Remember, you've got your spinal cord, and you've got this big fat swollen area here. I should have drawn it down like that. And then you've got another area coming out of the bottom of the spinal cord. Well, this fat area right here is called the dorsal root ganglion. We just call it DRG for short. And the reason it's swollen is because it contains, again, cell bodies of neurons. Most of the neurons that are in the dorsal root ganglion are what we call unipolar neurons. So that's a neuron that has a dendrite that comes from, say, your arm or your finger, and then it comes up and it forms a cell body, and then it sends out an axon like that. So it's just got one pole coming off the cell body there. So that would be a unipolar neuron. So that's what's contained mostly in this dorsal root ganglion. So you're getting information coming in from the outside. The cell body is right there, and then it goes back and synapses in the spinal cord. The ventral root, this lower one down here, that's the ventral root right there. Just ignore all my scribble. Let's try again. That's your ventral root, okay? Your ventral root is, again, going to carry motor information. So it's telling some part of your body what it needs to do. So that information is going to be going that way. And then the dorsal root and the ventral root come together and form that spinal nerve. So your spinal nerve carries both sensory information and motor information. Let's see what else I need to tell you about that. I think I covered all that. All right, well, let's go to the next one. What do you need to do with this spinal cord? Well, of course, it communicates with the brain and your tissues, but sometimes you have what are known as spinal reflexes. And this is where you just kind of bypass the brain and you just have this action that occurs that you don't even think about, And you have different kinds of spinal reflexes, but a spinal reflex is going to be a rapid kind of pre-programmed response to a stimulus that doesn't usually involve the brain. So let's say you touch a hot stove. Do you want to send that information to your spinal cord, then up to your brain, and then your brain says, oh, gee, that's hot. I better get your hand off that, and then send some more information down, then go, okay, take your hand off like that? Or would you rather touch a hot stove and immediately go, oh, that's hot. I don't want to touch it, and pull your hand back? Well, it's a reflex reaction that allows you to do that. So these reflexes are not something that you have to have brain input to do about. It's a pre-programmed response. Now, they're quick, they don't waste time, and they usually are, you're born with them. So that would be these intrinsic reflex reactions where you have a pain and you just automatically know to pull away from that painful stimulus. But they can be learned or acquired. You think about an athlete. What do? They do repetitive exercises over and over again so that they don't even have to think about an action. When a ball's coming to them, they throw their glove up and they catch it. If I just was to throw a ball at you right quick, you'd probably go like this or blink or duck or something. That would be your reflex. But they do learned or acquired reflexes where they can actually just, respond without even thinking about what they're doing. It's just like eventually, like when you start driving a car, you're like, oh gosh, okay, I got to push on the pedal, I got to steer, and I've got to do this and that. But I've been driving for 40 years. Actually, probably more than that. I started driving really early. But I don't even think about driving. I'm putting on makeup, I'm eating, and the car is kind of on autopilot or reflex reaction. Now, that's probably, I'll be the one that gets in a wreck and kills somebody because of that. But you just acquire reflexes, though, as you practice more and more at something. And again, remember that they usually only involve the peripheral nerves and the spinal cord. All right, well, let's look at a reflex and see exactly what it's involved. Excuse me. All right, you have what's called the reflex arc, and there's 5 components of a reflex arc. I'm going to show it to you first, and then I'm going to go back and explain this. So let's just look at the different components. First of all, you're going to have a receptor. So that could be a pain receptor or a temperature receptor or something like that that is receiving information and it gets stimulated. Well, when it's stimulated, that is going to cause a sensory neuron to send information. It's going to go up into that dorsal root ganglion where you're going to have that cell body right there that makes it swollen. And then it's going to send that information down to the spinal cord like that. So that's your second part of your reflex arc is your sensory neuron. Then you have an integration center. And basically all that is it's a little short interneuron. And an interneuron, again, is a neuron that's between 2 neurons. So you've got this little short interneuron here that's going to receive that information, and it's going to decide, let's just send something back out. And in this case, it would be a motor neuron that it's sending information through. And that motor neuron is going to go out of that ventral root, and that's going to go to your effector, and it's going to synapse with your effector there. In this case, the effector is a muscle. So if I'm touching that hot stove, it's going to tell my muscle to flex. So when it flexes, it pulls my hand away from that stove. So those are the basic components of the reflex arc. Now let's go back and make sure you understand them all. All right, first of all, the receptor. That's going to be whether it's pain, temperature, stretch receptors, whatever, you've got some receptor receiving stimulus. The second component is your sensory neuron. That's the one that is afferent. It's bringing information to the spinal cord, okay? So that's carrying information to the spinal cord. It carries it usually through a unipolar neuron. So it's unipolar, and the cell body of that neuron is usually going to be located in the dorsal root ganglion. Then you have the interneuron, which is that short neuron that connects the two, the sensory neuron with the motor neuron. And that just kind of processes the information and said, oh yeah, we got to get that hand off of there quick. And it tells that motor neuron, which is your next component there, to send a signal out to cause a muscle to contract, to pull that arm away or that hand away from the painful stimuli. And then finally you have the effector, which is going to be that muscle or whatever it is that you're telling it to move. So you just kind of make this little circuit, and that's how it goes. All right, you have some common reflexes, and the one I just described is known as a flexor reflex. It's also known as a withdrawal reflex, and that's because it's called called flexor or withdrawal reflex because that's what it's doing. It's flexing a muscle in order to withdraw your hand or something from the painful stimulus. Then you have what's known as a crossed extensor reflex. And just think about it. If I'm touching a hot stove and I pick my hand up like that, that's no big deal. But what if I was stepping on a nail and I picked my foot up and I picked it up real quick? Notice how my body's going back? That's going to make me really want to lose my balance. So you have what's known as a crossed extensor reflex. And what this does, the flexor part of the reflex is going to protect you from some painful or bad stimulus. So it's going to remove you from that stimulus. Well, the crossed extensor reflex is going to help you balance when you have that flexor reflex. So the two go hand in hand. So with the crossed extensor reflex, you're having that flexor reflex, but then you're also going to have a balancing motion of the opposite limb, and that's going to keep you from falling down when you pull away. So let's say, I'm putting my hand on something that's very, very dangerous or painful. And it really works better if you talk about feet and legs because that's more involved with balance. But if I pull away real quick, notice my other arm is coming out. So I'm flexing this arm, but I'm extending this arm to maintain my balance. And so this crossed extensor reflex helps you maintain your balance. Well, how does it work? Well, again, let's look at our spinal cord here. So we're going to draw our gray matter of the spinal cord. There's our central canal. We've got our stimulus out here, which is that first component of the reflex arc. So let's say it's a painful stimulus coming in, and then it's going to bring a signal in through the dorsal root ganglion and with our sensory neuron, and that's going to synapse right there in the dorsal horn of gray matter. So that's our second component, that sensory neuron. Then we have an interneuron right here that's going to kind of integrate that information and go, okay, yeah, we need to get your hand off of that or your foot off that painful stimulus. So this is our third segment of the reflex arc. And then finally we have the motor neuron that sends out information and synapses with a muscle and tells that muscle to contract and that or flex, and that's your fourth component of the reflex arc would be that motor neuron. And then your muscle, which we'll just kind of draw a muscle right there. That's a really bad muscle, but that's a muscle anyway. That's going to be your fifth component of the reflex arc, which is your effector. Okay? So that's your basic flexor or withdrawal reflex. Now, if you have a crossed extensor reflex, what happens is you still get your painful stimulus coming in here, number one, and it is carried through that sensory neuron, number two. It synapses with an interneuron, number three. But instead of just having that one synapse with that interneuron, it's going to synapse. It's going to send another interneuron over here to the other side of the spinal cord. Now, if you think about it, the spinal cord kind of divides your body in right and left halves. So all the information on this side is reflecting the right half, and all the information on this side is reflecting what's going on your left half. Well, with a crossed extensor reflex, you have flexing of one side, but the contralateral or opposite limb is going to extend. So you've got to get that information across to the other side, and that's where that other interneuron comes in here, and it sends out information to there. So then you're going to send out a motor neuron. It's going to tell your other limb out here to extend. So this one over here is going to flex and pull away. So that's your flexor reaction. This one on the other side of your body is going to extend, and so that's going to balance out. So you flex this one and you extend this one. I don't know what this is, but we'll just get rid of it here. Okay? So that's pretty much what your crossed extensor reflex is. And then finally you've got what we call superficial reflexes. this would be like, an example of that would be like your plantar reflex or your abdominal reflexes. Let's talk about the plantar reflex. That's if you take like the bottom of your foot, so pretend my hand is the bottom of your foot, and if you took like a tongue depressor or something like that and you just kind of gently pulled it along the outside edge of your foot, the reflex that you would expect would be for a curling of the toes as you do that. So you'd have the toes curl, and that would be your normal reflex. Well, if you're looking to see if somebody's got spinal cord damage or something like that, or if their neuroanatomy is not all tied together and working right, that's why the doctor tests you for all these reflexes. Well, in this particular one, if things weren't working right, if you did like that and expected this reaction, what might happen is you could get this reaction where your toes actually fan out. That's known as the Babinski reflex. That's B. I don't know what's happened to this. I'm going to just try to go back here. It went away. All right, we're almost done anyway, so let's ignore it. But Babinski is B-A-B-I-N-S-K-I. So it's a Babinski sign. That's just when the, normally you would expect the toes to curl, but if you do this and they fan out like that, that's your Babinski sign. And that tells the doctor, man, you got something going on here. Your reflexes aren't working right. One thing you need to note on that Babinski sign is in kids under like a year old, like babies up to a year old, if you do that to the bottom of their foot, they're going to do a positive Babinski sign. Their neurons are not myelinated well and everything's not connected well, so they don't have that normal curling reflex reaction. They will have, it's normal for them to have that Babinski sign. But if you see it in an older person or an older child or an adult, then that fanning or Babinski sign would be very abnormal. So that's how we can use reflexes to just assess a patient and see what's going on. Well, I hope you have a better understanding of the spinal cord and spinal reflexes. If not, you can come see me and I can hopefully clear it up with you or go see your instructor. But that's all for today. Thanks.